Welcome back to your Essential Small Groups. This week we will be exploring the climax of Absalom's rebellion and his defeat by David's army. In chapter 15 of 2 Samuel, David's son Absalom overthrows his father. He takes the throne from him. After being driven from Jerusalem, David gathers his men and he launches an attack to reclaim the kingdom from his son. Now that's where chapter 18 picks up. David is preparing his men for the upcoming battle to retake Jerusalem. What we're told is that he desires to march with his army. He wants to fight with them, but his generals are worried about his safety. So they dissuade him. It's just too dangerous for David to fight with his men. David reluctantly agrees to stay back. However, before his army departs, David commands his troops to be gentle with his son. Be gentle with Absalom, he says. And the narrator makes a note that all the troops heard this instruction from David. It's quite clear that the narrator wants the reader to know that David was in no way involved in the death of his son Absalom.
Well, as Colin said, David's men march out to battle, and once the battle begins, Absalom's conscripted army proves no match for the seasoned professional warriors of David. Well, Absalom's forces are routed, with thousands killed on the battlefield. In addition, we're told that during the battle, Absalom is riding a mule, and as he is passing under a large oak tree, he becomes caught in the thick branches. Despite the request of David to treat Absalom gently, Joab, one of David's generals, decides to kill Absalom. The story then builds dramatically to the moment when David receives the tragic news of his son's death. 14 verses stretch out the tension as rival runners bring word of an anxious father who pleads for the news and the welfare of his son. When David receives word of the victory, he dismisses it, wanting to first know about Absalom's fate. When he finally learns about Absalom's death, the success on the battlefield is hidden from view by the magnitude of David's grief. David's role as father, protecting a rebellious son, is allowed to prevail over any portrait of him as a ruthless king putting down a rebellion.
This story, this powerful story, it addresses us on multiple levels. First, the story depicts the depths of a father's grief over the loss of a son. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the strains, every parent can identify with losing a child. David's statement that he would willingly have died in Absalom's place is emblematic of our willingness as parents to sacrifice our own welfare for the welfare of our children. In light of Absalom's rebellion, this story is particularly meaningful to parents of children who have chosen self-destructive paths. Despite our willingness to sacrifice as parents, so often we find that we cannot save our children. And so this portrait of David's grief, it helps us identify with David as a father.
So now as we look at David's pain, what we also see is that David is caught in a tension between his role as a father and as a king, between his private and public roles. Well, as a king, he must treat Absalom as a traitor. But as a father, he cannot accept this for his son. Now, Frederick Buechner, a well-known Christian writer, says about David's desire to die in the place of his son, he meant it. Of course, if he could have done the boy's dying for him, he would have done it. If he could have paid the price for the boy's betrayal of him, he would have paid it. If he could have given his own life to make the boy alive again, he would have given it. But even a king can't do things like that. As later history was to prove, it takes a God who is also king. This story reminds us how hard it is to balance public responsibility and familial love. Unfortunately, many of us learn too late how we should prioritize love. The truth is, David's love could have made a difference. In the years preceding this story, David's choice to prioritize his role as king helped to give birth to the tragedy he later faced. Instead of just allowing Absalom to return to the kingdom, David could have also allowed him access to his love. Too often, our public responsibilities trump our familial role. And this lack of love, it occurs not just at a familial level, but also at the level of society. We grieve the violence that breaks out in our world. We grieve over issues of poverty, education, substance abuse, consumerism, these things that distort the future of our children. But what we need to remember is that the time to address these issues comes before the tragic consequences. You see, our challenge is to break the cycle before we come to these tragic moments of grief, whether they're in our individual lives or in society. In our story from 2 Samuel, David's love comes too late. One wonders what could have happened if David had shown his love to Absalom.
Lastly, we need to see that David's weeping is not only for Absalom, it's also for himself. David is not innocent in this story. In his rebellion, Absalom has mimicked David's own arrogant grasping for power. David's grief, it speaks not simply of parental loss, but of the recognition of his own sins. In our own lives, we often experience grief not only as victims, but also as perpetrators. William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, and Alan Patton's Cry the Beloved Country, these are two celebrated novels that use this story from 2 Samuel to describe a son's rebellion and a father's grief. When you read both novels, what you find is they're situated in racially divided societies. And they're stories about sons who were brought to grief by the injustices that their fathers have put in place, which the sons, of course, imitate. In both stories, the fathers recognize too late the price that their sons have paid for their own sins, leaving the fathers with grief and emptiness. You know, the picture we meet of David in the story, it will forever touch the human heart. It's a witness to David's pain as a father, but it should also remind us that the time for love can run out. As one writer warns us, there are stories in which the prodigal son does not come home, and the waiting father's embrace is empty. And so as we remember that, may that not be the case for us. May we learn from David to prioritize love.